Night fell over the abandoned industrial city where rusted metal structures creaked with each gust of wind. Dwight huddled against a broken shipping container, his large frame shivering in the cold that seeped through his worn clothing. His hands were calloused from years of hard labor before he lost everything, his jacket thin and damp from the afternoon rain. The only warmth he had came from an old blanket that once belonged to his wife, the last thing he had of her after the accident that had taken her life and sent him spiraling into homelessness. The blanket was faded blue, frayed at the edges from years of use, but Dwight cherished it above all else. On the corner was an embroidered flower, a forget-me-not that Sarah had stitched herself when they were first married. So you'll always have something beautiful, she told him, her eyes crinkling with the smile he'd fallen in love with. Now those eyes were gone forever, and the blanket remained his only connection to a life that seemed increasingly like a distant dream. Dwight had been on the streets for nearly a year now. The economic collapse had cost him his job teaching high school science, then his home, and finally his dignity. But he'd survived, scavenging through the abandoned industrial district, collecting rainwater in rusted drums, and occasionally doing odd jobs for scraps of food. At 43, his body was still strong despite Clear's throat, the malnutrition and exposure, his mind sharp despite the trauma of losing everything. The blanket was his most precious possession, shield against both the cold and the crushing loneliness. The distant sound of traffic was his lullaby most nights, punctuated by the occasional wail of police sirens that sent him deeper into the shadows. Tonight, however, something else broke the silence. A brilliant flash of light streaked across the sky like a tear in the fabric of darkness, followed by the sound of impact nearby, a crash that shook the ground beneath his feet. The noise echoed through the empty building, setting off car alarms in the distance. Dwight's first instinct was to hide. Unusual events rarely meant anything good for a homeless man. But something about the quality of the light, a bluish-purple glow unlike anything he'd seen before, stirred the scientist still alive inside him. Curiosity overcame caution. He wrapped the blanket tightly around his shoulders and ventured toward the source of the disturbance. Behind a mountain of trash and a rusted dumpster, Dwight spotted an unusual bluish glow, pulsating weakly. The light ebbed and flowed like a heartbeat, casting eerie shadows across the debris-strewn alley. He approached cautiously, each step measured and silent, as he'd learned to move through the city unnoticed. What he found made him freeze in place. A small child-sized figure with blue skin lay sprawled, Clear's throat on the ground, bleeding a strange luminescent fluid from several wounds. The child wore a torn protective suit, unlike anything Dwight had seen, made of materials that seemed to shift color slightly with each labored breath. The blue-skinned being's chest barely moved. Each breath seemed painful, producing a whistling sound from what appeared to be gills along the neck. Dwight had seen many strange things during his time on the streets, but nothing like this. His mind raced through possible explanations: a child in costume, an elaborate prank, a hallucination brought on by hunger. But the evidence before his eyes defied conventional explanation. This was something not of this world. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, he felt an unexpected calm. Scientist in him, observing details with clinical precision. The child appeared to be approximately 5 years old by human standards, though. Proportions slightly differently. Limbs a bit longer, head slightly larger. The blue skin had a faint pattern like scales, barely visible except when the light hit it at certain angles, and the blood, if that's what it was, glowed with bioluminescence, a trait no terrestrial vertebrate possessed. Dwight hesitated, taking a small step back when the alien child's eyelids flickered, but something in the being's eyes when they opened, pain, fear, resignation, resonated with the man. They were emotions he knew intimately, had seen reflected in his own eyes in broken shop windows. Despite the alien appearance, the fundamental vulnerability of a wounded child transcended species. Without a word, he approached and carefully removed his precious blanket, placing it over the shivering blue child, tucking it around the alien's small shoulders with the same care he would have shown his own child, had he been blessed with one. The forget-me-not embroidery rested near the child's face, its blue petals almost matching the hue of the alien's skin. The being's eyes flew open, revealing irises of deep amber with vertical pupils that widened. In surprise, they studied the human man with an expression of disbelief, as though unable to comprehend this simple act of kindness. The child's hand, forefingered with an extra joint, reached out tentatively to touch Dwight's arm. "You're hurt, little one," Dwight whispered, his voice rough from disuse. These were the first words he'd spoken aloud in days, having learned that talking to oneself on the streets only invited unwanted attention. "Don't worry, I'll help you." The alien child tried to speak, but managed only a weak series of clicking sounds that meant nothing to the man. When the blue-skinned visitor attempted to sit up, he immediately collapsed back down, his breathing labored and movements jerky. A wave of pain washed over the alien's face, and Dwight recognized that expression. It was universal, transcending species and worlds. Looking more closely at the child's injuries, Dwight could see what appeared to be burns along one side of the small body, and a deeper wound across the abdomen that leaked the luminescent fluid most heavily. The protective suit was torn and charred in places, suggesting some kind of crash or explosion. Drawing on long-forgotten first aid training, Dwight knew he needed to stop the bleeding and keep the child warm. He scrambled to retrieve an old water bottle he'd salvaged earlier, one of his few possessions besides the blanket. The plastic was cracked but still held liquid. He returned to offer it to the wounded child, who studied it momentarily before accepting. The small alien, Cliff, though Dwight didn't know his name yet, took small, grateful sips, his throat moving oddly as he swallowed. Water spilled down his chin, mixing with the luminescent blood, creating rivulets that glowed softly in the darkness. Looking around for anything that might serve as bandages, Dwight spotted a discarded t-shirt that seemed relatively clean. He tore it into strips and carefully bound the worst of the child's wounds, working gently to avoid causing further pain. The alien watched him with those strained amber eyes, curiosity gradually replacing fear as Dwight worked. The night air grew colder, and Dwight noticed the alien trembling more violently. Without hesitation, the man pressed close, sharing what little body heat he had. The alien child stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed, his breathing becoming slightly more regular. Dwight felt an unexpected protectiveness wash over him. This small, wounded creature was just a child lost and hurt far from home. Whatever differences existed between them seemed trivial compared to their shared vulnerability in this moment. "It's going to be okay," Dwight murmured, though he had no idea if that was true or if the child could understand him. "I've got you." In the distance, engine sounds grew louder, mechanical hums that seemed to search rather than pass by. Searchlights swept across nearby buildings, methodical in their patterns. The alien child's face contorted with alarm, mandible-like structures at the sides of his mouth quivering with what could only be fear. His small hand instinctively reached for something at his belt, but whatever had been there was gone. The search pattern was unlike any police or military procedure Dwight had ever witnessed. The lights moved with unnatural precision, systematically covering every inch of ground as they approached the crash site. Whoever or whatever was searching knew exactly what they were looking for. Dwight pressed a finger to his lips. Silence, a gesture he hoped would be universally understood. He'd hidden from authorities enough times to recognize the value of stillness. The child nodded once, showing he comprehended. Together they retreated deeper into the shadows of the alley, Dwight carrying the small alien as gently as possible to avoid aggravating his wounds. They found shelter behind a collapsed wall, the narrow space just large enough for both of them if they pressed close. Together, the helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight cutting through the night like a blade, missing their hiding spot by mere feet. The light lingered briefly on a nearby alley before continuing its sweep and gradually fading into the distance. Only then did Dwight release the breath he'd been holding, his shoulders dropping with relief. "I don't think they saw us," he whispered, though he knew the child couldn't understand his words. The tone, however, seemed to convey his meaning. The alien relaxed slightly in his arms, the tension in the small blue body easing marginally. The man gently touched the child's shoulder, feeling the strange texture of skin, somewhere between scales and smoothness. Cool to the touch but not cold. He offered wordless reassurance until the alien's eyes finally closed in exhausted sleep. Dwight remained awake, vigilant, studying this visitor from beyond the stars. Despite everything he'd lost, he felt an odd sense of purpose stirring within him, a need to protect this vulnerable being who had quite literally fallen into his life. As the night deepened, Dwight's scientific mind cataloged observations. The child's breathing pattern followed a rhythm unlike human respiration. 3 quick breaths followed by a longer one. The luminescence of the blood gradually dimmed as the makeshift bandages did their work, suggesting some kind of clotting mechanism similar to human platelets. Most fascinating were the tiny, phosphorescent freckles across the child's face, which seemed to pulse faintly in time with what Dwight assumed was a heartbeat. Despite the alien physiology, there was something undeniably childlike about the being's face in sleep, an innocence that transcended species differences. Dwight found himself wondering about the child's home, his parents, the circumstances that had brought him to Earth alone and injured. Had there been others? Was anyone looking for him besides the ominous searchers? Dawn broke with heavy footsteps entering the alley. Deliberate, coordinated movements that instantly set Dwight on edge. A squad of armed beings in dark suits approached their location, their forms tall and imposing against the pale morning light. They moved with military precision, weapons drawn but held at ready positions rather than aimed. Like the child, they had blue skin, but their faces were harder, marked with what looked like ceremonial scars or tattoos that followed the contours of their facial bones. Dwight instinctively tightened his hold on the sleeping child, his body tensing as he calculated escape routes and found none. And GT, clear his throat. And GT, the aliens had them surrounded there. Weapons unlike anything he had ever seen. Not quite guns, not quite energy weapons from science fiction, but something between the two with an organic quality to their design. The alien child, stirred by the commotion, woke with a start. Leaning against the wall for support, he struggled to sit upright. His strength nearly depleted, one small hand pressed against a wound that still seeped luminescence. He swayed dangerously, and Dwight instinctively steadied him, his protective instinct overriding his fear of the armed newcomers. One of the alien warriors shouted in an unfamiliar language, causing Dwight to raise his hand slowly, showing he was unarmed. The universal gesture of surrender seemed to register with them, as several lowered their weapons. Slightly, the child raised his hand, pointing toward the man. His voice, though weak, carried authority that seemed incongruous with his small size. He spoke rapidly in their language, clicks, whistles, and deep tones that seemed to require more than one vocal apparatus. The warrior's posture changed immediately, weapons lowering further as they exchanged glances. Dwight remained silent but stood his ground, shoulders squared despite his fear. He'd faced enough hardship to know that showing weakness often invited aggression. He kept one hand on the child's shoulder, a gesture of protection and connection that didn't go unnoticed by the watching warriors. The armed aliens surrounded them, their weapons creating a perimeter that made escape impossible. One warrior, distinguished by additional markings on his armor and a more elaborate helmet design, knelt down and spoke through a translator device attached to his throat. "The prince is alive." The words were tinged with disbelief and relief, the mechanical translation carrying emotional overtones despite its artificial nature. The kneeling warrior studied Dwight intently, head tilting slightly as though puzzled by the human's presence. "Prince," Dwight repeated the word, catching him off guard. He looked down at the child with new understanding, not just any lost alien child but royalty, which explained the coordinated search effort and the deference the warriors now showed. The child gestured toward Dwight, his movements indicating that the man had helped him survive the night. He then spoke again in their language, the translator catching fragments. "I helped me, gave warmth, stopped bleeding." The warriors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable behind partially transparent helmets, but they ultimately decided to bring the human with them. One reached for Dwight, who tensed but did not resist. The child made another sound, sharper, commanding despite his young age, and the warrior withdrew his hand, instead kneeling to the man's level. "You save Prince. Prince say you come. Save." The translation was rough, heavily Accented but understandable, the warrior placed his fist against his chest. What appeared to be a gesture of respect or gratitude, Dwight looked from the warrior to the child, seeking confirmation. The injured alien nodded, once the movement causing him visible pain. After a moment's hesitation, Dwight stepped forward, still holding the edge of his blanket that remained draped over the child's shoulders, a tenuous connection between them. "I'll come," he said, knowing they probably couldn't understand his words, but hoping his compliance was clear. "But I'm not leaving him until I know he's safe." The warrior extended his hand, palm up, in a universal gesture of peace. The bluish skin had a subtle iridescence. In the morning light, tiny scales, catching the sun like microscopic prisms. Dwight placed his hand in the alien's, feeling the strange texture, cool and slightly rough, like touching fine sandpaper. The warrior nodded in respect and gestured for Dwight to follow as another carefully lifted the injured child. The young prince protested weakly, trying to walk on his own, but his injuries were too severe. With reluctant dignity, he allowed himself to be carried. They moved toward what appeared to be a vehicle disguised beneath camouflage tarps, its true form impossible to discern until they were nearly upon it. When the tarps were pulled aside, Dwight gasped involuntarily. The craft was unlike anything in human engineering, organic curves blending with geometric precision, materials that seemed to breathe with the subtle rhythm of its energy systems. No visible engines, no exhaust ports, nothing that conformed to terrestrial aeronautics. The child was carefully placed on a stretcher-like device that hovered without visible support. Medical devices immediately attached to monitor his condition. The instruments made soft musical tones as they worked, displays showing information in a script Dwight couldn't begin to decipher. As they prepared to leave, Dwight watched the abandoned industrial park disappear behind them, wondering if he would ever see Earth again. The rational part of his mind knew he should be terrified. He was literally placing himself in the hands of aliens, boarding their craft to an unknown destination. Yet a strange calm had settled over him. After losing everything that defined his life, perhaps there was a certain freedom in this final, incredible departure from normality. The vessel's interior defied Dwight's expectations. Instead of the sterile, mechanical environment of science fiction, the spaces were warm, organic, filled with living plants that seemed to form part of the ship's systems. Light came from bioluminescent panels that adjusted their brightness automatically as they moved through different sections. Most striking was the absence of sharp angles. Every surface curved gracefully into the next, creating a sense of continuous flow throughout the vessel. The journey took hours, passing through underground tunnels and hidden passages that seemed designed to avoid detection. Dwight remained alert, studying his captors or rescuers, he wasn't sure which they were, and keeping his eye on the injured child. Medical personnel worked over the young prince, their movements efficient and coordinated, using instruments that seemed to melt with their hands as they treated his wounds. The child remained conscious throughout, occasionally looking toward Dwight as if to ensure the human was still there. Despite the pain he must have been experiencing, the young prince maintained a composure that seemed beyond his years, issuing occasional commands that the others obeyed without question. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, they were approaching what Dwight initially took to be a mountain range on the horizon. As they drew closer, his perception shifted dramatically. What he had seen as natural formations revealed themselves as massive structures partially camouflaged against the landscape, a magnificent engineering feat that human technology couldn't begin to approach. A massive spacecraft hovered above an isolated clearing, its surface shifting between visibility and near perfect camouflage as active light bending. Technology responded to changing environmental conditions. The vessel was unlike anything in human science fiction, organic yet geometric, its material seeming to breathe with the subtle rhythm of its energy systems. Dwight was led aboard via a ramp that materialized from the hull itself, his senses overwhelmed by the technology that surrounded him. Inside, he witnessed the child being rushed to what appeared to be a medical bay, distinguished by symbols that pulsed with gentle light. The medical staff moved with increased urgency now that they were aboard the main vessel, speaking rapidly in their clicking language as they transferred the young prince to a more sophisticated treatment platform, a female Aridex with silvery eyes that caught the light like mirrors approached Dwight, her movements more fluid than the warriors, her build slightly less imposing, though still taller than an average human. She wore what appeared to be a ceremonial garment over functional clothing, suggesting a position of authority outside the military structure. Igia, she said through a translator, pendant that hung around her neck, the device more elegant and accurate than the warrior's equipment. You safe, you help Prince Cliff. We grateful. His name is Cliff, Dwight asked, the human-sounding name surprising him. Translation approximate, Igia explained, her expression showing understanding of his confusion. True name has sound humans cannot make. Cliff, closest match in your language. He's a prince, Dwight continued, watching as medical personnel swarmed around the small blue figure there, instruments emitting soft pulses of colored light that seemed to sink into the child's wounds. Third son of Supreme Commander Atlora, she confirmed, her translator conveying a note of pride, very important. Disappeared during diplomatic mission to survey Earth. Dwight nodded slowly, processing this information. The implications were staggering, not just contact with an alien species, but confirmation that they had been studying Earth perhaps for some time. Will he be okay? Yes, wounds heal. You saved him when others would not. Her silver eyes studied him with curious intensity, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Why you help alien child, most clears throat, humans fear different. The question caught Dwight off guard. In the moment of finding Cliff, he hadn't consciously weighed options or considered the child's alien nature. He had simply responded to a wounded child, he thought for a moment before answering simply, he needed help, he's just a kid. Something in Gia's expression shifted. Approval, perhaps respect. Come, you must be hungry. She led him through corridors that curved in gentle arcs, the walls embedded with what appeared to be living circuitry, veins of luminescent material that pulsed with information or energy. Dwight couldn't determine which. Other Arctics they passed stopped to stare at the human, their reactions ranging from curiosity to evident distrust. Dwight heard fragments of translated Conversation from nearby translator. Devices. Human Prince Finder. Commander interested. The next several hours passed in a blur, as Dwight was given food unlike anything he'd tasted before. Flavors that defied categorization. Textures that changed as he consumed them, providing a sensory experience beyond terrestrial cuisine. He was cleansed in water that seemed to remove grime without soap, the liquid somehow identifying and dissolving dirt while leaving his skin's natural oils intact. They provided clothing made of material that adjusted to his body temperature, offering warmth without bulk or weight. Throughout it all, Dwight kept asking about Cliff, receiving assurances that the young prince was recovering well. Gia explained that the child had been separated from his diplomatic team during their covert observation of human settlements. A malfunction in his personal transport had caused the crash Dwight had witnessed. Others searching when you found him, she explained, but wrong place. Signal. Scrambled by city metals. Why was he alone? Dwight asked, troubled by the thought of sending a child, even an alien one, into such a dangerous situation. Gia's expression suggested this was a complicated question. Young ones see differently, fresh eyes. No preconceptions. Cliff, specially talented, can sense emotional states across species, valuable for first impressions. When finally allowed to see the child, Dwight was led to a recovery chamber where Cliff sat propped against cushions, his blue skin still pale, but his eyes clear and alert. The boy's face lit up when he saw the human enter, a chirping sound escaping before his translator activated. Dwight, the child said the name, sounding strange with the alien inflection. You remembered. I didn't tell you my name, Dwight said, confused by the greeting. Cliff tapped his temple with a four-fingered hand. Mine touch when I sleep, he explained the translation, giving the words a matter-of-fact quality that belied their extraordinary implication. Learned some things, not allowed usually. But emergency, you read my mind. Dwight asked, unsure whether to be impressed or disturbed. Not read. Touch different, Cliff struggled to explain through the translators. Limitations. Like feeling echo. Not thoughts. Memories, clears throat with strong feeling attached. Dwight approached cautiously, still uncertain of his standing among these advanced beings. The recovery chamber was comfortable, but clearly designed for medical observation, with subtle instruments embedded in the walls and ceiling. How you feeling, kid? Better. Cliff's eyes, so alien yet so expressive, studied the human with unabashed curiosity. You homeless? No. Family sat inside. The directness of the observation made Dwight wince. Yeah, well, life happens. Why you give blanket? Last thing of mate. Person. Dwight clears throat. Hesitated, uncomfortable with the question. The blanket lay folded at the foot of Cliff's bed, clean but still recognizable with its embroidered forget-me-not. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have done in the same situation. You needed it more than I did, he said. Finally, the simple truth behind his action. Cliff considered this, head tilting in a gesture that reminded Dwight of a curious child, regardless of species. Father will want meet you, saved royal blood, very important to Ardex. Ardex, that's what you call yourselves? Dwight asked, seizing the opportunity to learn more about his hosts. Yes, from Homeworld Arctic boss. Cliff seemed pleased by the humans. Interest. 7 systems under Arctic protection. The scope of this statement, casual. Reference to multiple star systems under. A single government left Dwight momentarily speechless before he could formulate another question. The door slid open to admit a towering Arctic, whose presence immediately filled the room. Unlike the others, his blue skin was darker, almost indigo, and covered with intricate markings that seemed to serve as both rank insignia and personal history. He moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to command, his amber eyes immediately fixing on Dwight with an intensity that made the human want to step back. Father, Cliff's voice carried both respect and affection. The Supreme Commander inclined his head slightly toward his son before addressing Dwight directly, his posture radiating authority that required no translation. I am Zerk, commander of the Arctic Fleet, and guardian of the 7 systems. His voice through the translator was deep and resonant, the device struggling to convey the natural power behind his words. You saved my son when you had no obligation, when most of your kind would have run or attacked. Dwight straightened, meeting the commander's gaze despite his intimidating presence, years of facing down school administrators and angry parents had given him practice in maintaining composure before authority figures. He's a child, where I come from, that's obligation enough. Something flickered in Zerk's expression, surprise, perhaps respect. Then your people have more honor than our intelligence suggested. He stepped closer, towering over Dwight. You gave your only possession to save my son, the blanket from your mate. Dwight tensed, uncomfortable with how much they knew about him through Cliff's mind. Touchy. The invasion of privacy, however well-intentioned, left him feeling exposed. It was just a blanket. No. Zerk's tone broke no argument. It was sacrifice. Among Arctics, such actions create blood debt. I owe you life of my line. The formality of the statement hung in the air between them. Dwight, unsure how to respond, simply nodded, recognizing the cultural significance even if he didn't fully understand it. We returned to Atlora, Zerk continued. You will come, learn our ways, find place if you wish it. It wasn't really a question, but Dwight understood he was being offered choice, the first real choice he'd had in years. He looked at Cliff, the small alien prince who watched the exchange with bright, intelligent eyes. Then back at Zerk, whose imposing presence somehow conveyed not threat but opportunity. Doesn't seem like I have much waiting for me back there, Dwight said finally. I'll come. The journey to Atlora took several days by human reckoning, though time seemed to flow differently aboard the vessel. Dwight was given quarters near Cliff's, a gesture of honor he didn't fully understand until Gia explained that proximity to royal family members was reserved for highest-ranking officials and blood debt holders, not guest quarters, she emphasized. Family quarters, significant. The room itself was more luxurious than anything Dwight had experienced even before becoming homeless. A spacious chamber with living walls that responded to his presence, adjusting temperature, light, and even ambient sound to create optimal comfort. The bed conformed to his body perfectly. The food dispensed by wall units, tailored to human nutritional needs, while introducing him to Arctic cuisine. During the journey, Dwight spent hours with Cliff, who was eager to learn about Earth and humans. The boy's quick mind and endless curiosity reminded Dwight of the teacher he had once been before. Economic collapse had eliminated education funding and sent him spiraling into poverty. For the first time in years, he felt the satisfaction of sharing knowledge, of seeing understanding dawn in a student's eyes, even if those eyes had vertical pupils and were set in blue skin. Why humans fight other humans so much? Cliff asked during one of their sessions, his translator struggling to convey the genuine perplexity behind the question. Dwight sighed, unsure how to explain humanity's complex history of conflict to someone from a seemingly more unified civilization. That's a big question, kid. Resources, beliefs, power, sometimes just fear of those who are different. Like fear of aliens. Cliff's head tilted, the now familiar gesture of curiosity. Yeah, though we haven't had much experience with actual aliens until now. Dwight smiled faintly. Mostly we've just imagined what you might be like, in good ways or bad ways. Both, Dwight admitted. Some of our stories have aliens as wise teachers or allies, others have them as invaders or monsters. Which am I? Cliff asked, the directness typical of his questions. Dwight considered the small blue figure before him, a child with the weight of diplomatic responsibility on his shoulders, yet still possessing the essential innocence of youth. Neither, you're just Cliff. The answer seemed to satisfy the young prince, who nodded thoughtfully before launching into another line of questioning about Earth animals, which he found particularly fascinating. In return, Cliff taught him about Arctic culture, history, and the complex political structure of the seven systems. Dwight learned that the Arctics were an ancient race, technologically advanced, but traditional in their social structures. Family lines and honor debts formed the backbone of their society, with personal loyalty valued above abstract ideologies. He also learned that Earth was classified as a quarantined world, a planet with intelligent life deemed too volatile and internally divided to welcome into the greater galactic community. The diplomatic mission that had brought Cliff to Earth had been controversial, part of a reassessment initiative pushed by progressive factions among the Arctics. Why send a child on a diplomatic mission? Dwight had asked Gia during one of their conversations. Royal children trained from birth for observation, she explained, while showing him how to operate the ship's information systems adapted for human use. Pure perception, not clouded by adult preconceptions. Cliff, specially gifted, can sense emotional states across species boundaries. This explained the mind touch Cliff had mentioned and why the young prince had been sent despite the apparent dangers. It also explained why the search for him had been so intensive once his vessel lost contact. You have children? Gia asked, unexpectedly, her silver eyes studying him with that penetrating gaze that seemed characteristic of her species. The question caught Dwight off guard. No, he answered after a moment. Sarah and I, we wanted to, but there were complications, medical issues. Gia nodded, the translator unable to fully convey the subtlety of her expression. Yet you know how to care for young one. Natural instinct. I was a teacher, Dwight explained. High school science for 15 years before the schools closed. Teacher, she repeated the word, seemingly holding special significance. That explains much. Among Arctics, educator highly valued, sacred. Profession. The notion of teaching as a sacred profession brought a sad smile to Dwight's face. How different from Earth, where he'd been discarded without a second thought when budgets tightened, where his years of service meant nothing against financial expedience. As they approached Atlura, Dwight was invited to the command deck to witness their arrival. The planet itself was breathtaking, dominated by vast oceans of deep purple with landmasses of russet and gold arranged in archipelago patterns, but more impressive were they orbital structures, massive platforms that housed millions connected by transit systems that appeared as glowing threads from a distance. Atlura itself hostile to surface habitation, Zark explained, noting Dwight's awestruck expression. The commander had taken a surprising interest in the humans' education, often joining Cliff sessions to observe or add his own perspectives. Ancestral home, but we live above now. In Sky Cities, the vessel docked with one of the largest platforms, a sprawling structure that Dwight learned was the Royal Administrative Center and home to the ruling families. As they disembarked, he found himself the center of curious attention, the first human most Arctics had ever seen in person. Whispers followed him through the gleaming corridors. Earth being, save the prince, commander's blood debt, primitive but honorable. Dwight kept his focus on Cliff, who walked ahead with the natural confidence of a child who knew his place in the world. Despite his small stature, the young prince commanded respect from all they passed, receiving formal salutes from warriors and respectful bows from civilians. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences as Dwight adjusted to life among the Arctics. He was given quarters in the royal sector, a gesture that raised eyebrows among court officials, but was not questioned openly given Xerxes' declaration of blood debt. Gia was assigned as his cultural liaison, teaching him proper protocols and explaining the complex social hierarchies that governed Arctic society. Cliff visited daily, often bringing educational materials or small gifts, artifacts and curiosities that helped Dwight understand his new environment. Despite the difference in their ages and species, a genuine friendship formed between them, the shared experience of their first meeting creating a bond that transcended conventional relationships. The young prince took particular delight in showing Dwight the education facilities where Arctic children learned. Unlike Earth schools with their rigid structures, these were organic spaces where learning happened through immersion and experience. Teaching was considered one of the highest callings among Arctics, with educators holding status equal to military commanders. You could teach here, Cliff suggested one day as they watched young Arctics engage with an interactive model of a star system about Earth, about humans. The idea struck Dwight as both appealing and daunting. I don't know enough about your people yet, and the language barrier neural integration solved that. Cliff interrupted confidently, Father already approved. Neural what now? Dwight asked, alarmed by the implication. And GT, clears throat. And GT, Cliff laughed, a chirping sound that the translator didn't bother to interpret. Not invasive, temporary overlay like translator, but deeper. You learn our Language properly. But beneath the Laura's gleaming surface, tension simmered. Dwight, with his outsider's perspective, noticed subtle signs of political strain. Increased security measures, hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, warriors drilling with greater frequency and intensity. When he questioned Gia about these observations, her typical openness gave way to careful evasion. Internal matters, she said dismissively. Nothing that concerns Earth beings. The evasion only heightened Dwight's curiosity. He began paying closer attention to patterns of movement, to the rotation of guards, to which areas suddenly became restricted. His years of navigating survival on Earth streets had honed his observational skills, allowing him to piece together fragments of information into a concerning picture. One evening, as Cliff showed him star patterns from an observation deck, Dwight carefully broached the subject. "There's trouble coming, isn't there?" he asked quietly, keeping his tone conversational as they gazed at the spectacular view of space beyond the platform's transparent sections. Cliff's expression flickered, mandibles twitching slightly, a tell the boy hadn't yet learned to control. His eyes darted to check if they were alone before responding. "Father says not to worry Earth friends with Arctic problems." "I'm not just any Earth friend," Dwight countered gently. "I'm your Earth friend." "That means I worry when you're worried." The young prince studied him, internal conflict evident in his amber eyes. Finally he sighed, a very human gesture he'd picked up from Dwight. "Draxons," he whispered, the word carried weight even through the translator. "Old enemies want control of 7 systems. Think Ardex too, flexible with other species. And they know about me being here." Dwight guessed, the pieces fitting together. Cliff nodded solemnly. "They say Father weak for bringing Earth being to Atlar. Say humans dangerous, unpredictable. Use as excuse for new aggression." "They're not entirely wrong about that," Dwight admitted. "We can be pretty unpredictable, but not dangerous," Cliff insisted, his small hand reaching out to touch Dwight's arm. "Not you." Before Dwight could respond, alarms blared throughout the sector, pulsing tones that he had learned signified security breaches. Cliff immediately tensed, his young face shifting to an expression of alert focus that seemed too adult for his years. "Attack," he said simply. "Come." The young prince grabbed Dwight's hand, pulling him away from the observation deck and toward what appeared to be a maintenance access point. Despite his small size, Cliff moved with purpose, inputting a code that opened a hidden passage. "Royal escape route," he explained as they entered the narrow corridor. "Need to reach command center. Father will protect." They moved swiftly through passages designed for emergency evacuation, emerging occasionally into main corridors where chaos reigned, civilians rushing toward shelter areas, warriors moving in coordinated formations toward defense positions. Through viewports, Dwight caught glimpses of beyond the platform, where sleek predatory vessels with distinctive red markings were engaging Arctic defense ships. "Draxon raiders," Cliff explained tersely. "Vast ships, special forces." As they approached the central sectors, an explosion rocked the platform, sending them both a-sprawling. Emergency barriers slammed into place, sealing off sections where atmospheric integrity had been compromised. Cliff quickly reoriented himself, checking an access terminal for alternative routes. "Command center sealed," he reported. Grimly, defense protocol. Is there a secondary command post? Dwight asked, falling back on practical problem solving to manage his growing concern. Cliff nodded. Sector 7 Engineering. Control. He hesitated, studying the terminal. Many Draxons between here and there. Dwight considered their options. His size and strength compared to Cliff's gave him certain advantages, but he was unarmed and unfamiliar with the platform's layout. You know these passages better than I do, he said finally. I'll follow your lead, but if we run into trouble, you let me handle it. The prince looked up at him, surprised by the authority in his tone, but nodded agreement. They continued through increasingly damaged sections of the platform where evidence of firefights, energy scorches on walls, discarded weapons, occasionally the bodies of fallen warriors, testified to the ferocity of the Draxon assault. Cliff moved with impressive stealth for a child, his smaller size allowing him to scout ahead through maintenance ducts that Dwight couldn't access. At one junction, the prince froze, signaling for silence before retreating back to Dwight's position. 3 Draxons, he whispered, blocking path to Sector 7. Dwight peered around the corner, catching a glimpse of the enemy for the first time. The Draxons were taller than Ardex, with mottled gray-green skin and reinforced exoskeletons covering vital areas. Their weapons were brutal-looking devices that combined elements of energy projection and physical damage, practical rather than elegant like the Draxons themselves. Is there another way around? Dwight asked quietly. Cliff shook his head. No time. Engineering control important. If Draxons take it, can vent atmosphere in civilian sectors. The implications were clear and horrifying. Dwight studied the corridor, again noticing a control panel for environmental systems nearby. His mind raced back to his teaching days, to basic principles of physics that might apply even here. Those suits they're wearing, he whispered, do they have independent air supplies? Cliff nodded. Combat armor, short-term life support, and if the atmosphere in that corridor suddenly became unbreathable, the prince's eyes widened with understanding. They activate helmets. Temporary disadvantage. Exactly. I need you to tell me which controls would flood that section with something non-lethal but disruptive. Can you do that? Cliff moved to the panel, his small fingers dancing across the interface with practiced ease despite his youth. Royal education, Dwight realized, was apparently comprehensive. After a moment, the prince looked up. Ready. Will release cleaning vapor, harmless, but causes disorientation in Draxon physiology. Dwight nodded, picking up a length of broken conduit that would serve as a makeshift weapon. On my signal, hit the release. I'll handle the rest. When Cliff activated the system, dense white vapor poured from vents throughout the corridor. The Draxons reacted immediately, helmets snapping into place with mechanical precision. But in that moment of transition, their vision and awareness were compromised, exactly as Dwight had hoped. He charged forward, using the heavy conduit as a bludgeon to strike the nearest Draxon before the alien could properly orient himself. The blow connected with satisfying force, sending the raider crashing into his companion. The third Draxon turned, weapon raising, but Dwight was already in motion, closing the distance before the alien could fire. The fight was brief but brutal. Dwight had the advantage of surprise and desperation, while the Draxons were hampered by the vapor and their expectation of facing Arctic resistance rather than a human combatant. When it was over, 3 unconscious raiders lay on the deck, and Dwight had acquired a Draxon weapon, an ugly but effective device whose function he grasped through simple observation. During the skirmish, Cliff emerged from cover, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and concern. "You hurt?" Dwight wiped blood from a cut on his forehead. "Nothing serious. Let's keep moving." They continued toward engineering control, encountering less resistance than expected, a concerning sign that suggested most of the Draxon force was concentrated elsewhere, likely around the main command center. When they finally reached their destination, they found the engineering section largely intact but abandoned, its crew presumably evacuated during the initial assault. Cliff immediately moved to the main control interface, accessing systems with the authority codes his royal status provided. Status displays flickered to life, showing the extent of the damage across the platform. Atmospheric breaches in multiple sectors, power fluctuations throughout the grid, and most concerning, a coordinated Draxon push toward the central reactor core. "They're going for a complete takeover," Dwight realized, studying the tactical displays. "If they control the reactor, they control the entire platform." "Yes," Cliff confirmed grimly, "and more. Atlara platform controls orbital defense network. If Draxons take it, they can attack the other platforms unopposed." Dwight finished. "We need to warn your father." Cliff attempted to establish communication with the command center, but interference, whether natural from the battle damage or deliberate jamming from the Draxons, prevented clear transmission. After several failed attempts, the prince looked up at Dwight with frustrated concern. "Cannot reach command. Must secure reactor ourselves." The determination in the young alien's voice gave Dwight pause. "That's too dangerous. You're the prince. You should stay somewhere safe while I try to reach the reactor." Cliff shook his head firmly. "Royal duty to protect. No reactor systems better than you. Need both." Before Dwight could argue further, the engineering doors slid open to admit a squad of Arctic warriors led by a familiar figure. Gia, her typical diplomatic attire replaced by combat armor, a nasty-looking gash across one cheek. Cliff. Dwight, relief flooded her features. "Command lost contact. Fear worst. We're trying to reach the reactor." Dwight explained quickly. "The Draxons." "Yes, we know," she interrupted. "Reactor control is primary objective. Command center compromised. Supreme Commander Zerk leading counterattack, but ordered prince secured first." Cliff stepped forward, his small stature somehow diminished by the authority in his bearing. "Not leaving. Going to reactor. Royal authority." Gia looked torn between duty to protect the prince and respect for the chain of command. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded reluctantly. "We'll escort to reactor, but you stay behind defense line," she insisted. "No negotiation." With the addition of trained warriors, their progress toward the reactor became more efficient. Gia's squad cleared path through contested areas with practiced coordination, while Dwight kept close to Cliff, providing additional protection. The human's unfamiliar fighting style more direct and improvisational than Arctic combat doctrine, proved surprisingly effective against Draxan raiders accustomed to predictable opposition. As they approached the reactor sector, evidence of heavy fighting increased. More structural damage, more fallen warriors from both sides. Communications remained spotty, but fragments of tactical updates suggested the battle for control of the platform had reached a critical phase, with neither side gaining decisive advantage. The reactor itself was housed in a massive chamber at the literal heart of the platform, its pulsing core protected by multiple security layers and containment fields. When they finally reached the outer perimeter, they found signs of a desperate last stand by the Arctic reactor technicians and evidence that the Draxans had eventually broken through. Life signs inside, one of Gia's warriors reported, checking sensors. Multiple Draxans working on reactor containment systems. Sabotage, Gia concluded grimly. If containment fails, catastrophic cascade, Cliff finished. Destroys platform, maybe others nearby. Dwight studied the entry points, the number of enemy forces detected, and their own resources. The odds weren't good, but he'd faced worse during his darkest days on Earth. We need a distraction, he said. Finally, something to draw their attention while a smaller team accesses the control systems. Gia nodded in agreement. Warriors provide assault, technical team enters through maintenance access. I'll go with the technical team. Dwight volunteered. I've got experience with sabotage systems. This wasn't entirely true. His knowledge of nuclear reactors was theoretical at best, but he knew enough about sabotage methods to recognize common approaches. More importantly, he wasn't about to let Cliff face danger without him. Gia studied him skeptically but nodded. Take rear position, protect Prince. The plan was simple out of necessity. Gia's warriors would launch a frontal assault on the main reactor chamber entrance, drawing Draxan's attention and firepower. Meanwhile, Dwight, Cliff, and 2 Arctic technicians would access the reactor control systems through a narrow maintenance tunnel that, according to platform schematics, remained unsealed. As the warriors moved into position, Cliff touched Dwight's arm, drawing his attention. Dangerous, the prince said quietly. Not your fight. Dwight smiled faintly, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. Became my fight when I gave you that blanket, kid. The assault began with coordinated precision. Gia's warriors attacked from multiple angles, their tactics clearly familiar to each other from long training together. The distraction worked. Sensors showed Draxan forces converging on the main entrance, drawn away from the secondary access points. Dwight followed Cliff and the technicians through a maintenance access so narrow that even the small prince had to crawl in sections. They emerged onto a catwalk above the reactor's primary control room, where 3 Draxans worked methodically at the containment field controls. From their position, Dwight could see what they were doing, creating a controlled overload that would rupture the containment field but leave enough time for their forces to evacuate before catastrophic failure. The 2 Arctic technicians moved silently toward emergency override stations, while Dwight kept Cliff behind cover, the Draxan weapon ready if they were discovered. For several tense minutes their presence went unnoticed as the technicians worked to counter the Sabotage protocols. Then everything went wrong at once. One of the technicians slipped, sending a tool clattering to the deck below. The Draxons reacted instantly, weapons drawn, and firing before the AR deck could take cover. One technician fell immediately, the other returning fire while shouting into his communicator for backup. Dwight pushed Cliff further behind cover and leveled the Draxon weapon, firing at the saboteurs with more enthusiasm than accuracy. His shots forced them to seek cover, buying precious seconds for the surviving technician to reach the primary override. Containment failing, the technician shouted, "Need direct access to manual controls." Dwight looked where he pointed, a control panel on the lower level, directly exposed to Draxon fire. Anyone attempting to reach it would be cut down immediately. "Can you create another distraction?" Dwight asked the technician, something bigger than before. The AR deck nodded grimly, reaching for his equipment pack, emergency flares, brief blindness to unprotected eyes. "Do it on my mark," Dwight instructed. Then turned to Cliff, "Stay here, no matter what happens, don't move until Gia comes for you." "What you doing?" Alarm filled the young prince's eyes. "Something stupid and human," Dwight replied with a grim smile. "Ready," he called to the technician. When the flares detonated, the chamber filled with blinding light. The Draxons recoiled, temporarily disoriented, and Dwight vaulted the railing, dropping to the lower level. Pain shot through his ankle at the impact, but adrenaline carried him forward toward the control panel. Weapon fire erupted around him as the Draxons recovered, shots striking close enough that he felt their heat. He reached the panel frantically, searching for the controls the technician had described: manual override, emergency containment, restoration, anything to stop the cascade failure. A shot grazed his arm, searing pain cutting through his focus. Another struck the panel, sending sparks flying. Working through the pain, Dwight located the physical failsafe, a simple mechanical lever designed to function even when all electronic systems were compromised. He pulled with all his strength, feeling something tear in his injured arm. For a moment nothing happened, then emergency systems engaged throughout the chamber. Backup containment fields activating, coolant flooding critical areas, alarm tones shifting from imminent catastrophe to recoverable incident. Dwight had no time to celebrate this victory. A Draxon raider charged his position, abandoning ranged weapons for a wicked-looking blade. The human met the attack with desperate strength, using the Draxon's momentum against him in a move learned during countless street fights. They grappled at the edge of the control platform, evenly matched despite the Draxon's superior strength. Dwight's desperation compensating for the alien's natural advantages. When the Draxon drove his blade toward Dwight's throat, the human caught the attacker's wrist, redirecting the force outward. They teetered at the edge, struggling for balance, then fell together into the coolant reservoir below. The impact drove the air from Dwight's lungs. The coolant, some chemical compound he couldn't identify, burned against exposed skin while its density made movement difficult. The Draxon recovered faster, adapted to the liquid environment, pressing his advantage as Dwight struggled to remain conscious. As darkness crept into the edges of his vision, Dwight saw sudden movement above, Arctic warriors pouring into the chamber led by a towering figure he recognized instantly. Zark had arrived with reinforcements, his presence alone sending the remaining Draxons into retreat. The Supreme Commander himself dove into the coolant, pulling Dwight from the Draxon's grasp with irresistible strength. As consciousness faded, Dwight's last thought was of Cliff, hoping the boy had remained safely hidden during the chaos. He awoke in a medical chamber, his body suspended in a healing field that tingled against his skin. The injuries from the battle, the graze, wound, damaged ankle, chemical burns from the coolant were already healing. The Arctic medical technology far beyond anything available on Earth. Cliff sat nearby, refusing to leave, despite medical staff's insistence that he rest. When he saw Dwight's eyes open, the young prince's face lit up with relief. "Thought you dying," he said accusingly. "Very stupid human thing like you," said Clear's throat. Dwight tried to laugh, but managed only a weak cough. "Did it work, the reactor?" "Yes, you stopped Cascade, saved platform, saved many lives." The admiration in Cliff's voice was unmistakable. "Father very impressed, says human more honor than expected." "But high praise," Dwight murmured dryly. "Highest," Cliff corrected seriously. Father never impressed. Over the days that followed, Dwight learned the outcome of the battle. The Draxon raid had been repelled, though not without significant damage to the platform and heavy casualties among the defenders. Xerxes' counterattack from the command center had ultimately turned the tide. But according to Gia, who visited daily during Dwight's recovery, it was the reactor stabilization that had truly saved it. Laura, had containment failed, nothing else would matter, she explained. Your action gave Commander time needed for final assault. When finally released from medical care, Dwight was summoned to the restored command center. He entered with trepidation, still unsure of his status. Despite the apparent gratitude for his actions, the chamber was imposing, a vast space dominated by tactical displays and staffed by the highest ranking Arctics in the fleet. Zarek stood at the center, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. Beside him stood Cliff, dressed in formal attire that emphasized his royal status despite his small size. When Dwight entered, conversation ceased, all attention turning to the human Dwight of Earth. Zarek's voice carried throughout the chamber without apparent amplification. "Approach." Feeling decidedly underdressed in the simple Arctic clothing he'd been provided, Dwight moved forward until he stood before the Supreme Commander. To his surprise, Zarek inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect he'd never shown before. "The debt between us has grown," Zarek stated. "First my son's life, now many more." Dwight shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny of so many alien eyes. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Zarek countered firmly, "not what anyone would do. What warrior would do. What Arctic would do." He gestured toward a display showing Earth, your world remains quarantined. Divided, violent, but perhaps judgments too hasty. Cliff stepped forward, looking up at his father with an expression that combined respect with youthful insistence. "Told you humans complex, not just primitive." Zarek's mandibles twitched in what Dwight had learned was an expression of fond exasperation. "Indeed." Clear's throat. He returned his attention to Dwight. Council has deliberated. Unusual step. Approved. You offered place among. Ardix, not visitor, not ally, one of us. The offer stunned Dwight into momentary silence. You mean stay here? Permanently. If wish it, Zerk confirmed, would serve as Earth Knowledge Keeper, advisor on human matters, special guardian to royal house. His eyes moved briefly to Cliff, whose hopeful expression made the underlying meaning clear. The boy had requested this arrangement. Dwight thought of Earth, the home he'd lost, the society that had discarded him when he no longer served its purpose. Then he looked at Cliff, at Gia, at the community that had accepted him despite his alien nature. I'd be honored, he said finally, though I'll probably keep doing stupid human things from time to time. Cliff's face broke into a wide smile, mandibles fluttering with happiness. Best kind of things, the young prince declared confidently. In the months that followed, Dwight adapted to his new role in life among the Ardix. He served as a cultural interpreter, helping the Ardix understand human behavior and motivations as they carefully expanded their observation of Earth. He trained with Ardic warriors, combining their discipline techniques with human adaptability to develop a hybrid fighting style that proved particularly effective against Draxan raiders during subsequent encounters. Most importantly, he formed a bond with Cliff that transcended their different species and backgrounds. The young prince flourished under Dwight's informal mentorship, developing a unique perspective that combined Ardic tradition with human flexibility of thought. Together, they represented a new possibility that different species could not just coexist but complement each other, becoming stronger together than separate. One evening, nearly a year after his arrival on Athura, Dwight stood with Cliff on an observation deck overlooking Earth, a blue-green jewel against the blackness of space. The same blanket that had once been Dwight's only possession now served as a shared comfort, draped around both their shoulders as they watched the planet rotate slowly beneath them. Do you miss it? Cliff asked, his English now nearly perfect after months of practice. Dwight considered the question seriously. I miss what it could be, he answered. Finally, not what it was for me. Cliff nodded, understanding beyond his years evident in his expression. Father says humans not ready for contact, too divided still. He's probably right, Dwight admitted. But someday maybe. When ready, you help explain us, Cliff said with certainty. Bridge between worlds. Dwight smiled, resting his hand on the young prince's shoulder. That's a big job for one homeless guy. Not homeless now, Cliff corrected firmly. Have place, have purpose. Looking at the small blue-skinned child beside him, the unlikely friend who had changed his life so completely, Dwight felt a sense of belonging he'd thought lost forever. Yeah, he agreed softly, I guess I do.